The purpose of this talk is to kind of explore a situation that most web applications face, and that's that your application usually has to run in different environments and that its needs are different in each of those environments. I want to start out kind of by reviewing some of the approaches that we have available to us for dealing with that, and then outline some properties of the best system possible for solving this problem, and then suggest some implementation ideas that seem to work pretty well, at least for me so far, to solve them, and then wrap up with some practical examples. Everything that I'm going to show is going to be in Cake 3, of course, but it actually all applies to Cake 2 and even can be used in Cake 1 if you're still in that kind of situation. I want to start by explaining what I mean by an operating environment. An operating environment is the unique server and resource setup that your application needs in order to run. Everything that is collected around your application in order for it to actually operate. The simplest example of an operating environment is your local development machine versus a production environment. You may be using your local Mac or a Vagrant environment locally, and AWS or Rackspace or something else, or even a dedicated server in production. Those environments have different needs and they serve different purposes, even though the application tends to be the same in both of them. But your app has to behave slightly differently in each one based on where it is. So the most common example of this, of an environment-specific configuration, is a database connection. When you're talking to a database locally, you're typically going to be talking to a different database than the database that your server will be using in production. And there's actually a lot of examples like this, and almost all of them are around the outer edge of your application. Wherever your application is going to be talking to something external, that's a spot that's probably going to be different in each environment. So things like database, email, API services. And just as an example, if you're running your application in quality assurance, then you may want to override how email is delivered out of your Cake app so that it's all sent to QA staff, regardless of the intended recipient, so that they can actually verify that the email is correct. Or another great example is if you're doing payment collection or payment processing, you don't want to be talking to the production API when you're running your unit test suite. So just really quickly, let's take a look at databases. This is going to be an example that everybody's really familiar with. And the comic has absolutely nothing to do with the talk, but it's my favorite database joke, so throw it in there. So this is a database connection for Cake 3. It's a sample local development environment. Probably looks pretty familiar. There's no problems so far. But now when we want to launch this app to the public, we have to switch this connection to be something else. The conflict here is that the config keys need to be the same, and the config file needs to be the same because that's what Cake expects, except the values for each of these keys needs to be different depending on which environment the Cake app is running in. So what can we do? There's actually a lot of ways that we can solve this problem, and I want to take a look at some of the most common ones first. We can try just checking the domain name that we're running as, and do something different if we match something that we recognize. This isn't too bad if we're just displaying a simple string that gives us some kind of hint as what the environment is. In this case, we're just saying, okay, if our server name is site.com, let's say this is production, and just give people a clue. And if it's staging.site.com, let's say this is staging. And if in all other cases, if we don't recognize it, we're going to assume it's development. Now this gets a lot worse if we're trying to do something like setting up our database depending on the string. Now we're going to have to repeat this big, huge configure write clause for production and for staging and for development, and that's a really big, huge if-else clause that you're going to have in your code somewhere if you want to do it this way. So there's a bunch of problems with this approach. It can get pretty verbose and it can be pretty repetitive. And you may have to define these big chunks of really similar but slightly different code pretty much all over the place. And the other issue here is that we're limited to only the domain names that you code in. So if your domain name has to change for any reason, or if you add one, you're going to have to go and edit this setting everywhere in the app where you're trying to do something different for each of these environments. So maybe we can take a different approach and just not store any of the configs in the database instead. So if we add our config/app.php file to our gitignore file, and we're not going to put it in source control, it's not going to be part of what comes out when we do a clone, we're just going to have to write it directly into each environment. Now, this means that when a developer clones a project, they'll have to just build up an app.php file from scratch and somehow collect all of the necessary values that the app needs in order for it to function into that file for each of those environments. Maybe from a sample file or maybe from documentation. Somewhere there should be a list that says these are the configs that the app expects in order to work. And you'll have to repeat this process when you launch the app for real. When you go into production, you'll have to write that same file from scratch, except with the correct values. Now, the upside to this approach is that we've removed some passwords from the repository. They're not stored actually in the source control anymore, so that's kind of good. But we can't track any of the changes that we've made to the config set as we've been going along. We also can't double check a value for any given environment without actually going out to that environment and logging into the server and seeing what that config file says. Our source control is no longer kind of the master repository of all knowledge. We have to go find the correct environment and figure out what the value should be. And this actually can also be a problem depending on who has access to each of those environments. In addition, when we, as developers, change or add a new config value, now when we go to launch that code, somebody has to be responsible for making sure that that new key or changed key exists in this file that we have no control over, that just exists out there in the void. And obviously that's an issue. So we can take kind of the opposite approach to that and store all of the configs for every environment in the repo instead, and come up with some kind of creative way of naming the files and identifying the different versions of your configs so that they're all available. This kind of eases the deployment process a ton, because now we can just do our deploy, copy or clone or fetch or whatever our process is to get our latest code, and then copy the correct config file into place for whichever server we're on. And this was actually a lot worse in Cake 2, where you would have a dedicated database.php file and a dedicated email.php file and a dedicated core.php file, potentially for each environment. With 3 environments, you'd end up with 9 config files, and you'd have to make sure you copy them all. And actually, in this example, we've made a mistake, because we were logged into the production server, but somebody copied the staging config file into place, and that's probably going to cause a phone call or a pager or a tweet or something to happen. So on the upside, this approach at least will let us scan the config directory and have an idea of those environments. We're going to be able to see, okay, we've got a production config, and we've got a development config, and we have a QA config. Great, we've got QA. And it also lets us track the changes to the configs in the repository. So now when a developer does have to go add a key, at least they can access the files for all of those environments and make sure that that key is set everywhere. It's not perfect because they have to remember to get all of the files. And they may set it incorrectly in one of those files or in some of those files, or forget to set it at all. And again, as we saw, without any kind of automatic tooling in place when we're doing deploys, we may still encounter the problem where a developer or a sysadmin forgets to copy this file into place. If we do the fetch, we've got the latest code, the app is expecting this new configure var, but we haven't actually copied the file that has that configure var into place, so we don't have it available in that environment. So it's still kind of prone to human error. We've left that door open. And we still have the issue, we actually have the issue back where storing those private sensitive keys or passwords in the repository may be a bad thing or an impossible thing, depending on your situation. So let's switch gears for a second and talk about what an ideal system would need to look like in order to solve as many of these problems as possible. First, we want to isolate the detection of the environment into a single switch. We don't want to have if statements scattered all over the code that are checking the same basic idea. That needs to happen once, so that if the mechanism that needs to be used in order to detect what environment you're in changes, you only need to change it in that one spot in the code. And this can really be anything that you want, but I tend to prefer an environment variable. And in this example, it's just a variable called append that's set to the value of staging. And we're going to repeat it on the command line so that it picks it up for shells as well. It might be tempting to use an organic value from the environment as your switch value for what to use, such as a host name or an IP address or something else. But this binds your config naming to something that's actually outside of your control. Typically, we can't just up and change an IP address, and it may actually change without our intervention. If we're using AWS and we get assigned a new IP for a new instance, we might not be able to track that switch value against our code base. So it ends up restricting you to use something that's organic. It's better to use something that you can define yourself, an artificial switch, because that kind of gives you control independently of what environment this is. In this sense, you kind of want to declare your environment instead of inherit it. You want to say, this is going to be production, and not say, oh, some value tells me that this is production. Next, we want to leverage source control to the full extent that it's possible for us to do that, and that is with the caveat that we don't want to compromise security. So we want to put everything into our config sets into source control that we can, that's safe to do. And so we're going to put every config into source control, and this helps guarantee, again, that developers are able to make the changes that they need in both places, both where the config key is declared and where it's used out in the code base. The next thing to realize is that the easiest environment-specific configuration to manage is the one that doesn't actually have to change. That means whenever possible, we want to try and engineer our code so that it just does the same thing regardless of the environment. It should always be a last resort. We always want to fall back to the fact that we just can't have the same database in production that we do in development. If it's possible to do the same thing for both, do it, and don't mess with having to worry about different keys. And we also want to keep our app's behavior as dry as possible. We don't want to repeat ourselves. So if we do need to update how we change behavior for each environment, it shouldn't have to be changed all over the place. So again, we want to isolate the environment switch down to one point. And we also want to load the configs that are specific for that environment at one point. Nowhere in our app should we ever have to actually reference a specific environment. It should just already be provided for us. And then for the entire run of the application, we're only going to know about one set of configs, and that's just going to be the config set that we're provided. And this is actually kind of suggests the next characteristic, and that's that the set of config keys should be the same for every environment. There should never be a key that's available in production that is not also available in development. Your app should never have to check to see if something is available. It should always just do the same thing or do different things with the differing values. It should always be able to read the same key and just say, okay, because this key is not there, I'm not going to do something. But what this means is if you're putting your configure var lookup inside of a conditional clause, if it's in the parentheses for an if statement, that's probably a warning sign that you're going to try to do something that is based on a specific environment. You're going to look up a value and then do something specific to that environment. And what we want to do is move that out into the configuration itself so that we're going to execute that task all the time and just do something different based on the value we get back. Next, and as always, we want to reduce the possibility for human error. So we're going to make the most important environment that our app runs in the default environment. Usually this is production. It may be something different for you. But what we want to do is ensure that even if our switching for which environment our application is run in is missing or misconfigured or horribly damaged, our app will still run in production. If we forget to set up whatever mechanism it is that controls which environment our app runs in, it should not affect production or whatever your most important environment is. If you're going to have anything that fails, let it be QA, let it be development, let it be staging, let it be something else, but not the thing that's probably driving revenue. And we also want to avoid duplication in the configs themselves. So whenever possible, what we're going to do is default back to existing defined configs. In production, for example, a good example of this is debug. We're going to, in our default set, define debug to be false because we don't want to run it in production, and then only selectively enable debug in the environments where we actually need it. And what this means is that if we have no environment set, Debug's going to be off. We're going to have a nice, clean running application, and we might not be able to debug it, but it's not going to throw any visible errors to anybody. We have to opt in to that option. Now, there's still the case of highly sensitive configs, or configs that we just can't, for whatever policy reason, can't store in the repo. So to address this, our system also needs to have some way to have local overrides, untracked overrides. We still need to be able to load config values that are independent of our source control. And this may be for local testing. Maybe we want a developer to be able to set a value while they're working on a new feature. It may be for production where we can't store an API key in the repository, but in either case there needs to be a way that we can facilitate this without having to resort to any kind of trickery. Okay, this slide can get a little heady since it's actually the exact opposite of the name of this talk, but the idea here is we want to mentally separate the app itself from the collection of configuration values that it's able to obtain. The Cake app itself should only ever know about a single config set, this collection of keys and values. And it should not know, it should be completely ignorant of how that config set came to be created or populated. All it should ever do is just use the values provided to it. It shouldn't have to know how it was created or how it came to be. Just consume it. And the easy way to know that you've broken this rule is if you're referring to one of those identifying switch values in your code. If you ever see, I know personally, if I ever see the static string staging anywhere in my code, it means I'm trying to do something and I'm not letting configure do it for me. I can get that value, I can save that value into my configure set, have it loaded based on the environment, and then just read that value out of configure and trust that it will be right for whatever environment I'm in. So let's get back to a practical example. This is the same snippet I showed before. We're checking the name of the server and echoing a string that tells us what environment we're in. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just do configure read and dot message instead and have our browser spit out a different background color and a different message based on that? The code doesn't change. We're still just echoing configure read end message. But based on this background process, we're going to get a different output in our app. So how do we do this? The first step is to take advantage of a really well-built system that's actually already available to us in Cake, and that's configure. As I'm sure everybody already knows, it lets us define a key normally during the bootstrapping process and assign it a value. And then anywhere else in our Cake app, it's universally available to look up and read. Now, the nice thing about configure is it already gives us really great tools for loading additional sub or supersets of data on top of the set of keys that we already have. And to top it all off, Cake 3 has made this super easy for us because we don't even have individual config files for our database and our email configs and our core config anymore. They've put everything into configure already, so it's all consolidated for us. They've done almost all the work. So what we're going to do is, on top of normal Cake conventions, we're just going to define a couple of our own in order to keep things kind of sane. And the first one is we're going to declare our stock app.php file to be our mission-critical config. Everything that is production or the most important environment will be defined there. It will be a full set of config values. And then what we're going to do is, on top of that, have additional config files that are sparse. They're only going to define the keys that need to be defined for the environments that need different values that are different from production. And we're going to extend configure's capabilities to kind of include this environment awareness by adding some code that will do the loading for us and kind of cascade these values in the correct order. So just to orient you again, we're going to set up our server or our hosting environment so that we have an artificial flag available. In this case, it's a flag called append, and the value of that flag is staging. And we're going to be using this to determine which additional config file to load in our bootstrap process. So this is what Cake 3's normal config loading mechanism looks like. And what's important here, the most important thing actually, is to note that if we fail to load this file, it's a fatal error. Cake will abort if this file is not present. And we want to keep that in place because this is our production config. If we're missing our core config for production, that is a fatal error. We need to know about that. What we're going to do after that, after we load the default config file, is add this snippet into our bootstrap.php file below the normal load process. And what this snippet does is attempt to load 2 additional files. The first one is going to look up that value that we set for our app-env key and attempt to load a file with a matching file name. So in this case, it'll look for app-staging.php and attempt to load it. And on top of that, it will also load an app-local file, which is untracked, and that's the place where we can put all of our sensitive information or our development and testing information. Now, the impact here, it's not actually an exception if either of these is missing, and we need to keep it that way because in the production case, these files won't be there and don't necessarily need to be there. And we want to keep chugging right along. It's not an error if these are not there. We're just going to assume it's production and just plow through it. Now, the good news there is that even production will act exactly like production if we don't do any additional configuration. Even if we don't set that app-env in Apache or on the command line, this will just work right. So now that we have that additional file loading in place, let's take a look at a really simple sample production config file. And in this case, all we're doing is defining a debug key and then some environment keys. And this is our production configuration. Our application is called Wonderful Application. We've got a message to alert us to that this is production. And our hint color is white. Now this is our app-staging.php file. It's just an override file. So all we're going to do is turn on debug, and then we're also going to override the message and the hint color so that our users or our admins or wherever we expose this in the app will have an idea about what the current environment is. And again, note that we haven't changed the fancy name. We're going to fall through to the production config and still continue to use that in staging. So now when we put all this in source control, we're going to commit our app.php. That goes in. So do all of our other environment-specific files, app-staging.php. But we're going to leave app local out. That's just going to be an optional local file that we can use in production or development. And believe it or not, we're done. Like that's actually all the changes we need to make for this system to work. So now, whenever the app-env environment variable is set to something that matches a file name, this config read end message will spit out something different based on the contents of that file. And in addition, if we want to override with a local file, we can do that as well. So how does this approach tick all of the boxes from our ideal requirements? First, it uses a single environment switch. The switch is artificially defined, so it's under our control. We're tracking all of our non-sensitive configs in source control, so we've got at least that. And we can still scan the config directory and have an idea of what environments our app runs under. And anything that is sensitive or that we want to test with can be placed in app local on each server, and even production. We only need to check and load our environment once, and if that check fails in any way, we default to production or whatever our most important environment is. And because we've been careful about how we store our environment-specific values, our app doesn't actually need to be aware of what environment it's running in. It can just trust that configure is going to provide it with a value for whatever key it asks for that's appropriate for that environment. That's a little harder to demonstrate with this kind of basic example, but this actually also means that we don't have to resort to reading different keys in different environments. We don't have to say, if this one environment key is set to some value recognized, then read this other key and do something. All of that has already been done. That if statement has already occurred by loading our additional configs. Because our secondary config files only define overrides sparsely, we've kept our maintenance work to the minimum. So whenever we're going through and updating a config key or adding a new config key, we've reduced the chances that a developer is going to forget or miss one of those config files. Ideally, if they at least get production, it will at least be correct when it goes out the door. So that's at least the default case. They would have to do that anyway, even if we didn't have the system in place. And then all the other environments, because we've defined them to be less important, if they're wrong, at least we can catch it before it ships. We've also favored convention over configuration by quietly defaulting to production. So all in all, this does pretty well. So here's another example. This is actually a method I wrote. And I had to get a little creative here because I realized this is not PSR, but I had to get it to fit on the slide. So even after I switched to kind of this environment loading process, I had this method floating around, and it was just getting used to the idea. And the idea here is to just provide that visual cue to the user, or in my case, it was an admin portal, to let us know that we had the environment set up correctly. And there's a whole lot that's still bad about this. This is a helper method that I was calling in my main template, and it would accept an environment flag and an environment key, but it would also look it up if you didn't pass one. So it's trying to be helpful, but that means that we're actually still depending on that server variable in our code. And we don't need to. We've also have static hard-coded values of that variable. We've got vagrant, we've got staging. These are things that we should not see in our code. This should be coming out of configure for us. And on top of it, there's hard-coded CSS. So there's just all kinds of bad things about this. So this is what the refactor looks like. The first and biggest thing is we've moved everything that we can into configure. Let configure worry about the values for each environment. We don't even have to care about which environments we're talking to. We're just going to fetch the value and use it. Just trust that it's right. And then one of my design goals was to ensure that this was never engaged in production, so I kept the debug check in there. But we've got no more hard-coded $_server variable. We don't have any hard-coded strings for production, staging, vagrant, anything like that. We've defined a single format in our production config. So now that env_hint format is actually defined once for production and ignored for other environments. So it's not even duplicated between the config files. And this gives us way better flexibility since now the CSS snippets are defined in configure where we can get to them instead of having to actually change a class property out in our code somewhere. And plus, this is just way more readable. It's just shorter and easier to understand. These same concepts work in Cake too. It's a little bit more setup because you have to deal with database.php and email.php. I actually have an example project that I'm going to get to that has the boilerplate versions of these files. And what ends up happening is you get to just commit those. Your database.php file and your email.php file are now switched over to load their configurations just like Cake 3 does. And you can just leave those in your repo all the time. Everything is now in your core.php file. So just as a quick preview of what that looks like, this would be your core.php config file. And just like in Cake 3, we're going to define our data sources and our email transport. And then what we do is at the bottom of our core.php, since we've got a different bootstrapping process, we will do the same type of checking for and loading of those files. In this case, we've got to do a little bit of trickery to see if the file's there first, because otherwise configure load complains. And we don't want the complaint. We want this to fail silently. Now, I know this is small to read, there's a sample repo, but the basic idea here is that we are going to define a custom constructor for our database class. And what the constructor does is go out to configure and read our data sources variable and then populate all of the class properties that we would normally expect. So now this file is static. It never has to change again. You're not going to define class properties at the top of your database config class. Those will all come from configure dynamically. And the email config looks exactly the same except for the messages that we throw in the class name. And this is actually another really great example of the process of moving things out of your app that are things that are environment specific and moving them into configure and letting that system worry about it. This is the exact process that you should go through to get things out of your app and into the configure. This actually does work in Cake 1 too, with a really important caveat about how configure load works. It will replace subkeys instead of merging them. It doesn't use the new Cake 2, Cake 3 hash merge. So if you try to only define sparse keys, you'll end up wiping out the keys that are defined in production. But really just get away from Cake 1 and it'll be fine. I have an example project up on GitHub. It has both Cake 2 and Cake 3 sample repositories in there, projects. And it provides some walkthroughs, so like once you get the box up and running, it'll actually give you some things to run through and kind of experiment with this and be a little more hands-on. And having worked with this, I can give you some parting tips. This is the important stuff. The first thing is I recommend exposing your environment to the browser or to the end user somehow. Give yourself some kind of hint that your environment switching is working properly. That just helps a ton. What I typically do is I'll just change the background color of the admin navigation bar so that you can tell. If it's not working, it's going to look like production. If you're in Vagrant and it looks like production, something's not right. Try to use a consistent switch. If you're going to implement this in multiple projects, try to stick to the same way of doing it. It just gives you one less thing to try and debug. It's really fun. If it's not working, if you're not getting the right color in the header, it's one thing to have to go and try and figure out why that switch isn't available, but if you're having to check 3 or 4 different methods for why it's not available, it just complicates it and it's painful. And actually the fact that environments can require this switch, kind of the in-between requirements, or the in-between environments can require this, can be a gotcha. So a good example of that is staging or quality assurance. This is actually really easy in production because you don't need to define anything. It just works in production. And it's really easy in development because if you're using something like Vagrant, your box can ship with the correct key already set up. So it's never an issue in those two environments. Developers and production, they've got it made. But for things like QA or staging, we're actually going to go out and set up a server. If you forget to set this up, it will look like production, which is probably not the end of the world unless you're talking to an API service. But it's something to think about. You want to document how this is set up in your README or wherever your documentation is so that somebody knows to look for it. Along the same lines, if you're running cake shells as a cron job, make sure your cron environment knows about this. This doesn't actually come up that often because in production it doesn't matter, the key's not important. And in development it will already be set if you've set up your environment correctly. But if you're going to run a cron job in staging or something like that, you have to make sure that it gets perpetuated into cron. In Cake 2, you can do this really nice thing where the config values that you define in your core.php file, you can actually wrap in the double underscore method and have them pre-translated. So whenever you do a config read, they will just already come out of the configure set translated. It doesn't work in Cake 3 because the caching hasn't been set up yet. If you try to use the double underscore in your app.php when you're defining your big config array, caching won't be there and you'll get an error. If you know how to work around this, let me know. I haven't found a good solution yet, but it's something to be aware of. And then,
Create the caching before?
Yeah, you could do that. Yeah, you could set it up in your Bootstrap ahead of time and define the array. And then finally, if you're trying to retrofit this into an existing project, just go really slowly and carefully. Because we're specifically dealing with things that are different only in specific environments, it's really, really easy when you're adding this into an existing project to do something that you're not going to find until you get to production. Like that's kind of the whole point, is that it won't be there until production. So go slowly, test it, try to simulate your environments, see if it's going to work in production without actually being in production. And just think about the impact that it's going to have when you make these changes. That's it. I hope it's given you something to think about. I actually love talking about this, which is probably not surprising. So feel free to come find me and ask me questions. It's a pretty deep topic if you start kind of getting your head into it, so please. I think we got a little bit of time for questions. Yeah.
We do have something similar in Cake 2 where we are using the deployment system to actually move the file around. Do you have any experience with that? Is that really a bad idea? Or?
Yeah, that works, as long as it's automated. Like, my big thing is don't give somebody a chance to screw it up. So if there's computers that are doing it for you, fine. As long as it works, and you can meet as many of those goals, and everything is tracked and easily accessible and easily modifiable for developers, yeah. Anybody else?
Have you tried to output like a header in the console when you hit CakePHP, for example, or Bean Cake? Because something I find quite useful is to alert that you're using these settings when you're connected to.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. I don't have a specific example of that, but anything you can do to alert people that that's what you're operating under, the conditions under which you're operating, because this can get you too. Like, if you assume as a developer that you're working with one set of configs and it's not actually that set of configs, you will spend a lot of time debugging something that is not actually the source of your problem. So you want to provide those hints to yourself whenever you can. Yep.
I'm thinking about the decision to default to production credentials versus something else like local, and I'm often conflicted about this. And specifically when it comes to, like, I'm thinking about developers doing like something destructive, like dropping a user table or something, and that's a case where like they don't want to default, to production, because like screws up something in its environment, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, okay. So the question was, there's times where defaulting to production can potentially be dangerous. So if a developer is doing a table drop or something like that, and they're misconfigured locally, there's a chance that they could have an impact on production because that's our default case. I kind of have two responses to that. The first one is because we have these tools available to us now that give us really good control over our development environments, that tends to not come up. As long as you have a Vagrant box, like I said, the Vagrant box can ship to pretty much lock in the correct config right out of the box. There's no way that a developer could have that wrong unless they specifically broke it. So that's part of it. And if that's okay, like if that's an acceptable risk, then you can go that route. The other thing you can do is leave those configs out of the default config file and use a local config still. So you will have to, you have to kind of accept the risk one way or the other. You either have to accept the risk that you may accidentally do something to production from a development machine, or you have to accept the risk that when you go to deploy, you have to make sure you go set up these manual configs. And it's really just which one is the lesser of two evils for you. If you're super concerned about having a developer do something, then yeah, take those configs out. Don't give them the option to make the mistake, and live with the fact that you have to supplement in production somehow. Yeah.
So you're using app local, like on production, to do things like set your PayPal endpoints and set maybe database credentials and stuff?
Yeah, and it's all based on the context of your situation. If you have a private repo and it's on a private server and it's not GitHub and you trust all of your developers and it's not a problem to have your API key in your tracked app.local or app.php file, your production file, leave it there. It's easier. It's less to worry about. If you've got policies in place or if you have a client that objects to you having that information, anything like that, if for any reason it just doesn't work out, that's what app local is there for. It's that mechanism to give you that escape to still get all the benefit that you can out of it and compromise.
I got a question. So correct me if I'm wrong, the way you tell your production from your staging is through the debug key?
Well, no, it's actually the, let me grab this app env. So what we're doing is on our server, independently of our Cake app, we're going to define some value that PHP can pick up and read. And it can be anything you want. In this case, it's a variable called append, an environment variable. So the server actually has it set. You'll see it in Apache's output of what they have available. If you do a PHP info, it will show up there. If you echo or export on the command line, it will show up as a variable that's defined in the environment. And all we're doing is picking up on that value and using it.
Yeah, but you said in your code you shouldn't have, if this equals production or if this equals staging.
Yeah, that gets a little more difficult to get into, but the idea is that stuff you can push out into the configure files, the specific environment files, and then let the config loading process determine what the correct value is based on that switch, and you'll just get it. So you can always just do a configure read key, and you'll get the right value because the environment is set correctly. And the demo repo will have some examples of that too. Okay, thanks.